They were supposed to protect us from foreign threats, but somewhere along the way, the CIA became one of the biggest threats to American liberty. In tonight's Spotlight, we're exposing how the CIA became the brain of the deep state. And don't take our word for it. Listen to Senator Chuck Schumer.
You take on the intelligence community, they have 6 ways from Sunday at getting back at you. So even for a practical, supposedly hard-nosed businessman, he's being really dumb to do this.
Here with more is strategic and military advisor Edward Luttwak. So Edward, thank you so much for joining us here tonight on the show. Let's start with the absolute basics. Let's go back to the beginning. What was the CIA's originally built? What were they intended to do?
Well, they were simply to provide the United States with an intelligence organization, which every country by that time already had, which is a group of people, variously qualified, who would try and find out what's going on abroad and inform their government. But I must tell you right away, not to cause some incident on this program, that from my point of view, the horrible problem of the Central Intelligence Agency is its failure to collect intelligence about foreign countries. I want to keep it very simple and simply say that everybody involved in the 2003 Iraq War, not the 1990 Kuwait War, the Iraq War, everybody involved now admits that the plan to go to Iraq and set up a democracy in Iraq of all places, divided between different Kurdish groups and the Turkmen groups, the Sunni, of course, the Shia, of course, but Shia divided among themselves. But you thought of creating a rapidly establishing a democracy in Iraq had to know nothing at all about Iraq, which meant that the Central Intelligence Agency did not supply the National Command Authority, namely the White House, did not supply Congress, did not supply all of us with basic information about Iraq, namely that there is no worse place in the world, with the possible exception of Antarctica, where you can set up a functioning democracy. This gross intelligence failure was then paralleled with the second gross intelligence failure, that when people like Dr. General Petraeus said, oh, we spend another trillion or billion or whatever it was, and we will be able to have an Afghan army, there was no intelligence organization to point out that all the many different nationalities in Afghanistan, none of them is Afghan, because you have Pathan tribesmen, you have Uzbeks, you have Aymaks, you have Hazaras, for each of whom you can create a perfectly wonderful regiment that will fight loyally and everything. But you cannot have an Afghan army because the Afghan nation doesn't exist. And you cannot have people, you can't put Uzbeks and Aymaks in the same unit, or Pathans, and to fight against some enemy when they really want to fight each other first. So we have gone through 2 long, enormously difficult wars, expensive wars, because there was no basic intelligence feedback. And that, in turn, was due to very elementary things. Like, for example, the CIA station in Kabul, which is supposed to collect information there, if nothing else, none of those people there walked the streets, went in the bazaars, and heard people say basic things like, oh, making fun of the Afghan army that the Americans were building at great, huge cost, saying, anybody can get in there, you can become an officer by paying $50 more in bribes and so on. None of that came back. So much so that an American citizen who was not powerless, because he was Vice President Biden, a person whom I'm very willing to criticize for 10 different reasons. Nevertheless, he was vice president, and his reaction to the Afghan army plan to build up an army in Afghanistan to defend, which would end up costing us enormous amount of money, his reaction was, that's not possible. There is no Afghan nation. There are all these different nations. Nobody has ever built an army. You can build the French army, Portuguese army, you can build the Pathan army, you can build an Uzbek army. You cannot build an army made up of 10 different nationalities that happen to hate each other and kill each other on sight. So when he said that, Vice President Biden, Obama preferred to listen to the generals, Dr. Petraeus, General Petraeus, and so on, and ignored Biden. It was a convention in the Obama White House that Biden is an idiot. And the White House staffers would go to Georgetown dinner parties and make fun of whatever he said. Well, some of the things he said was 100% correct. He said the Afghan army is a racket run by President Karzai and his 7 brothers. He had more than 7 brothers, but at least 7 were involved. So he, vice president no less, gets zero support from the agency. Why? Because the agency doesn't actually know anything about Afghanistan. Why is that? Because to start with, they don't speak the languages. Don't speak the languages. The CIA has been recruiting American citizens on the basis that they're very easy to clear, to find out that they're not spies. And how do they do that? By establishing where they spent every day of their lives and whom they met and who they talked to. So they end up hiring people born in Utah, went to college in Utah, married in Utah, and then, having been brought to Virginia to Langley, then they send them to foreign countries and expect them to have a good feel and to understand and, of course, to know languages. So they don't know languages. They just don't. When you ask them, and you say, how come you don't know languages? Oh, we have language officers. That is, back in Langley, there are a number of people with a linguistic or academic background who are language officers. But the language officer is not the one who walks in the streets of Kabul and can overhear people in a bazaar making fun of the latest joke about the Afghan army. Now, I myself, not because of any accomplishment of my own, but simply because I was born in Transylvania. Then I went to school in Sicily. Then I went to England. I was volunteered overseas. I operated as a military consultant in many countries. I guess I speak maybe 7, 8 languages at some level, of course, some good, some not so good. I can read 3 or 4, but definitely if I'm walking in a bazaar in Kabul and I overhear people talking, even though I do not speak any of the Afghan languages, the only one I can understand is Uzbek because it's Turkic. And, anybody who can't learn a Turkic language in a week is an idiot. I mean, Turkic languages were made for that purpose. I'm serious. The Turkic language of India is called Urdu. Urdu comes from the Mongol word for camp. What was the language? It was the language they needed for all the soldiers of the Mughal Empire army that came from 7 nationalities, a common language they should speak together. And therefore, it is a very simple, rudimentary, and practical language. Now, Urdu is an example of the sort of language that the CIA should have 80 people can speak of. But the last time I went and talked to the National Intelligence Council, where there were 50 Middle East analysts, I started off by saying, since we're all Middle East analysts, why don't we do this in Arabic? Promptly, hands went up and say, I don't speak Arabic. So I then turned around and said, how many of you do speak Arabic? And there were about 6 people out of 50. Wow. Then I said, what about Farsi, the language of Iran, a country that we've been tangled with for years? And then 2 people raised their hands. Now, I did not test the 2 people. I did speak to a couple of these people who said they knew Arabic, and one of them did, because he actually was a Melkite from Lebanon. So in other words, my concern with the agency is it doesn't do its job of telling our leaders what Iraq is like. And if you go back to it, you'll realize that the United States entered into Iraq to establish a democracy in a country riven by the least suitable, did it actually with less research than an average American who likes snorkeling or scuba diving does before choosing a destination where to go scuba diving somewhere in the Caribbean, Seychelles, Maldives, whatever it is.
Yeah.
The average American who travels to these places does a certain amount of research.
Right.
And you want to establish that the coral is in good shape and this and various things. The CIA's information about Iraq before we invaded was not as good as that. Now, therefore, the people who wanted to bring us into Iraq, all they had to do was a very simple job, to keep out our former ambassador in Baghdad, who had lived in Iraq, at least as an ambassador, and maybe the previous one, and the consul general in Mosul, and maybe the previous one. Those 4 people were American citizens working for the government who knew something about Iraq. And when you went to them and say, what do you think about the project of establishing a democracy in Iraq? They would, depending on the humor, they might burst out laughing or might say, and tell me, are you going to be sunning ice in the Arctic anytime soon? And things like that. It was a most absurd project.
So how do we get here? I mean, so you're giving an incredible account of just, this is very basic. I mean, they don't do the job of gathering intelligence, and they don't provide that information to American leaders. So let me ask you, I mean, if I'm a man on the street, I'd ask then.
Got there, if I may interrupt you, simply because they were obsessed with security. And if you hire only people who have lived in one place all their lives and never met anybody, then you don't have to investigate any connections they might have had. The young American who is interested in foreign parts, who travels around and makes friends, maybe picks up a boyfriend, a girlfriend, or whatever it is, and this and that, they will not get a security clearance. In fact, my own assistant was denied the security clearance because she was an American woman who was in Iraq all by herself and all that stuff. And they asked her, how come you speak 2 of these different Kurdish languages? She said, well, I learned one in school, and the other one I went to Paris and I met the Kurd who spoke the language, very nice guy. I lived with him a couple of years. That's how I speak the Kurdish. Immediately, it was interrupted. The interview was interrupted. We cannot clear you. Goodbye. And this same person, a few days later, became an assistant secretary of state. Same individual. So what we are dealing is you allowed a group of people who, by the way, I will not refrain from telling you this, many of whom are Mormons, who run the security of CIA and keep out the very kind of young American interested in foreign parts who's picked up a language or 2, they simply prevent them from entering. So what we have here is a select, you understand, you prioritize security to the point where you only bring in people who have no foreign experience. And then you plunge them into foreign parts and you expect them somehow to be adept. And you're not.
So how, I mean, if I'm listening to this and I'm just a regular American taxpayer, I'm thinking, okay, well, they don't do that job very well at all for the reasons you mentioned. So what the hell do they do? What have they been doing for these decades?
What they do is, first of all, they have a whole technical section of people who work out very ingenious ways of collecting information electronically, technically, by some means or scientific means or other. And I'm not an expert on those things, but I have no reason to believe that they're not good. We have, of course, a separate agency, National Security Agency, that does the intercept. We have, unfortunately, 17 different intelligence organizations, many of them technical and all that. And the agency themselves has, in the past, shown great ingenuity technologically. But most people, the most important thing for us is human intelligence, because we don't need the war plans of foreign countries. What we need is situational awareness. Situational awareness to know that if somebody wants to build democracy, he should know whether Iraq is a country where you can build a democracy. And the moment you are aware of the situation in Iraq, you immediately conclude that it might be ready maybe in 200 years, 300 years, who knows. Now, I testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee just before the war, the 2003 war. And I said, it's not possible to establish a democracy in a country where you have different religious and ethnic groups that truly want to kill each other. You can't do it. It's like the United States on the eve of the Civil War, etc. So when I testified, the administration witness easily defeated me because they said Dr. Luttwak is a racist. Why? Because I said that the Iraqis are incapable of democracy. And now there should have been somebody else at that hearing, somebody who is the intelligence expert on Iraq, the head of the Iraq office. But he was not there. And if he had been there, he wouldn't have known anything because he had never been to Iraq. He has no feel for it. He doesn't know the difference between, a Turkmen and a Kurd and things like that. So this is a fundamental problem that we have. And in that regard, the State Department is much more knowledgeable about the countries with which we have diplomatic relations. Since we don't have an embassy in Iran, we are not getting that feedback. And by the way, the Central Intelligence Agency, unlike other intelligence agencies, only operates in countries where there is a U.S. embassy. Now, they do have a whole undercover group that they're very proud of, but they operate in countries like France or Poland. Mm-hmm. They don't step foot in Iran. They don't step foot in any country where they might be arrested and locked up, which means, for example, that in China, they try to operate out of embassy. You know, it's kind of farcical. They try to sneak out of the embassy to meet their contacts. Of course, any Chinese who works becomes a source for them. Operating out of embassy gets picked up and executed, but and so on. There's a refusal to accept that intelligence means having a real ability to be in societies, to live there, and they don't. The CIA has no personnel in Iran. There's nobody in Iran. This is a very important thing, not because that person fails to reach the presidential office and get hold of the document from the desk of Khamenei or something. No, because when you don't have anybody in Iran, it means you cannot take advantage of the people you can recruit. For example, an Iranian doctor from Isfahan is visiting Frankfurt. In Frankfurt, very safe, the CIA can be in Frankfurt. You pick him up in Frankfurt, and he has a son in the Revolutionary Guards. He has some intelligence and so on. But if you don't, and he says, I'm a doctor, I'm a doctor in Isfahan. Isfahan is a big tourist city and so on. If you have an undercover person in Iran, he can at least go to Isfahan and look up to see if there's such a doctor as Fandari in Isfahan. And then you can validate the source, that at least that there's a possibility that he really is a doctor, that really has a son, is a result. As it is, having nobody to check, you cannot validate even the sources that you recruited abroad. You are not recruiting sources in Iran because you're not there, right. But you could recruit Iranians abroad. But then you have to make sure, you have to be able to check them up. And for that, you need to have somebody in country, and they don't have.